You know, you probably fall into one of two camps this morning. It could be that you're here this morning and you're optimistic about change in the new year, being a different you, becoming different. You might be excited about some goals that you've set. Or it may be this morning that you are completely pessimistic about any changes that anybody's going to make in the new year. You've heard them say every new year that this is the year they lose the weight. This is the year that they're going to make those changes, and they haven't done it. And so you might be here and you're optimistic about the new year, or you might be here and you're a skeptic of the new year. And probably part of the reason that you find yourself in one of those two camps is because there are many people who promise you, if you will buy our product, if you'll enroll in our club, if you'll get a membership at our gym, then it'll all change this year. Plenty of people who are willing to make you a promise, if you'll buy our stuff, then you'll be different. And it may be that you look at me the same way, that I'm just one more person hawking that material. Truth is that we all have this sense that there's some secret out there that we don't know about. That if we had access to it, then everything would be different. You see this all the time online with articles that have clickbait headlines. Are you familiar with what clickbait is? It's an article that is geared to try to get you to look at it, and the company just wants you to look at their website so they can get advertising revenue. Some of the headlines are like, Indiana residents are shocked by this new law, ... You're like, oh, what is that? You click on it, and it's just a website full of ads. You got to click through 7 pages to find that it's some law, that it's not new, and it's not shocking either. Another headline might be, I couldn't believe what I saw at the end of this video. Or, health insurance companies hate this new trick. There are a lot of people that say, listen, if you just know this secret info, then your life will be different. And in Philippians chapter 3, Paul warns the people. He says, don't fall for that gimmick. Don't fall for that trick, that there is some secret to changing your life or being really spiritual. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 2, Paul makes this play on words, and it's lost on us in the English language because it doesn't sound the same. But in the original Greek, he uses this word for circumcision that sounds a lot like the word for circumcision in the Greek, but it really means to cause division or for mutilation. Or as the King James translates it in chapter 3, verse 2, concision. Paul was using sarcasm. Are you familiar with sarcasm? Paul was using sarcasm to say is, watch out for those who claim to give you the inside track on really being close to Jesus. Watch out for those who claim to give you the secret on changing your life, because all they're really doing is causing division or causing you to mutilate your flesh. But more importantly, what Paul tells them in the beginning of the chapter in verse 1 is, what I'm about to cover is something I've covered many times with you, but it is not a burden or difficult for me to go over it again, because it is wonderful to talk about and beneficial for you to hear. And the message that I want to share with you this morning is the same one that we find again and again and again in God's Word, but it is not a burden to hear it again because it's wonderful and it is beneficial to anyone who hears it. So in verse 3, he says, we rejoice that we get to tell of Jesus again, and we have no confidence in the flesh. You know what he's saying? He's saying, we know that it's Jesus who makes the difference, and that's no secret. And we have no confidence in the flesh. I don't know about you, but I have no confidence in my flesh. I'm pretty pumped that we're already 11 hours into the new year, and I haven't broken any resolutions yet. Because there have been times I've broken them in the first 11 minutes, right? I have no confidence that in me is the power to make a change. Paul was saying, listen, we're like you. We're skeptics. We don't believe there's anything in the flesh or in this life to trust in, but we do have something that we do have confidence in, and we sing about, and we rejoice about, and we're excited about, and that is Jesus, because He can make all of the difference. And if anybody knew that, it was Paul, because Paul made this incredible change in his life, a complete 180. So if you're here this morning and you are saying to yourself once again, this year will be different, This year I'm going to accomplish my goals. This year I'm going to quit turning back. This year I'm going to quit smoking. I'm going to quit drinking. I'm going to stop cheating. I'm going to lose the weight. I will move on. I will be happy. I will. Friend, let me tell you that if all of it's based on what you will do, I don't have a whole lot of confidence that you're going to make it to the end of 2017. Because your will is finite. It's of a limited supply. There's only so much willpower in your tank. There's only so much strength that you have. Now, there are a lot of tips that tell you how to stretch your willpower. And there's a lot of techniques for replenishing your willpower. But I want you to go beyond willpower this morning. I want you to plug into a power that is constantly, infinitely, dramatically, abundantly strong and supplied. So that when your willpower runs out, you don't have to give up on your goals and return to your old habits. Because it's not based on your willpower. It's based on His power. In 2017, I want you to plug into something greater than yourself. I want you to plug into something that is of an infinite, powerful supply. This power that I'm talking about was so great that Jesus was able to conquer death itself. If it can conquer death, it can conquer your addiction. If it can outlast death and endure the grave, it can endure your temptations that you face. Jesus, He had an incredible power. And Paul, his life changed when he came to know that power. One day, Paul was headed in one direction in his life. Suddenly, everything was different, and he made a 180. And it wasn't something that lasted a week. It wasn't something that lasted a day or a month or a year. It was something that lasted his entire life. And this new direction in Paul's life was something that he stuck to even when he was threatened with death. Now that is a powerful change in a life. How was it possible? How was it that Paul, who would write about in chapter 4, the next chapter, how he had endured through adversity and torture and poverty, how is it that he stayed focused and he continued in this new direction? How? It's because he came to know Jesus, and knowing Jesus changes everything. Knowing Jesus changes everything. And that's what he points to in this passage. Look at verse 10 of Philippians chapter 3. That I may know Him and the power of His resurrection, the fellowship of His suffering, being made conformable to His death. Paul's desire was that his life would be different because he knew Jesus and the power of Jesus' resurrection. See, that's it. That's the key. Knowing Jesus. Now, if this were a modern superhero movie, we'd say, man, Jesus is powerful. How did He get His power? We need to figure out how He got His power. We need to go back to the source of His power. We need to recreate that so that we can get His power. But the source of Jesus' power isn't a secret, it's Himself. And the way for us to have the same power of the resurrection is to know Jesus. Jesus constantly said, come to me and you can know this power and strength. It wasn't some hidden secret. It wasn't through some supernatural disaster. Jesus said, I am the source. Come to me and you can have this power in your life as well. You see, we rise to be new through knowing the one who rose from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead. And before that, He lived a life that was incredible. It was the most powerful thing that anyone had ever seen. Jesus caused the lame to walk again. He gave the blind the ability to see again. He fed thousands from food in a lunchbox. He calmed the raging sea. He made a fish give money to Peter. That's kind of fishing that I would like to get involved in. That when you fish, you pull up the fish and he's got a $20 bill in his mouth. Jesus was so powerful that He raised a little girl from the dead. And He did it simply by saying, little girl, wake up. Now you think about that for a minute. I can't get my own daughter to wake up from sleep by saying, Haven, it's time to get up. But Jesus awoke this little girl from the dead by saying, it's time to get up. That's power. He did all of this, and then he looked at a cross, which was the most painful form of torturous death, and he said, okay, I'll sign up for that. And he walked to it, and he suffered, and he bled, and he died on it, and everybody said, it's over, he's done, you can forget about him, and Jesus said, I'm just getting started. That's power. You don't need to know what Jesus' secret is. You don't need to see what kind of diet and workout regimen Jesus had. You just need to know Jesus. Paul said that I might know him and the power of his resurrection. Paul was saying nothing is more important than knowing Jesus. He says this in verse 7 and 8. But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. Paul says the things that were gained to me, those I counted for loss. The stuff that used to be important to me, the stuff that I used to really care about, the stuff that when I got it, I said, yes, I added something great to my life. Yes, I achieved what it was I wanted to achieve. All of that stuff, it seemed as lost to me in comparison to knowing Jesus. Do you hear that? Everything that Paul had strived for in his life and attained, everything that Paul had desired and gained, all of it, Jesus said, it's lost in comparison with knowing Jesus. Because knowing Jesus is that great. Paul is telling us that knowing Jesus is such a priority in his life that nothing else comes close. Nothing else comes close. He was making knowing Jesus the utmost priority in his life. And it wasn't merely something that he added on to his busy schedule. It wasn't something that he did on the weekends. It wasn't something that he fit in when he had a little bit of free time. He said, everything else in my life is loss in comparison to knowing Jesus. It's the most important thing to me. Now, when Paul says this, Paul wasn't saying, listen, I've moved all of the evil that I used to do down on my list of priorities and made Jesus my new priority in a list of bad things. Paul wasn't saying, listen, I stopped drinking and partying and cheating. I stopped doing all that to follow Jesus. No, Paul's life was already about religious stuff. Paul's life was about being a morally upstanding citizen and a respected leader among his church. And Paul said, all of that stuff I count for loss in comparison with knowing Jesus. You know what some of your problems are? It's that your life isn't messed up enough yet. That your life is not an absolute disaster yet. Because you think, hey, listen, I'm doing pretty good. And so this Jesus thing, that's probably a good thing for me to add on to my agenda and my schedule. Among all of the other good things that I do, this is another good thing that I will do. Paul, when he met Jesus, didn't say, I'm a moral guy, I'm an upstanding citizen, I'm a respected leader in the religious community, and I think I'm going to be a fan of Jesus too. He said, all of that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is Jesus. All of that other stuff is worthless now, because what I care about now is Jesus. People who've made an absolute mess of their lives don't have a hard time seeing that they probably need to leave the carousing and the partying behind so that they can become new. But people who live noble lives struggle to see that they need to jettison all of that, get rid of it to focus on Jesus. And this morning, you might have lived a pretty decent life in 2016. You might have felt that you were better than most. You might have paid all of your bills and been a good parent. But you don't realize that what you need more than any of that is Jesus. Paul wasn't a wreck of a human being. He wasn't someone who was causing problems and hurting children and getting in bar fights. Paul was a religious man, and then he met Jesus and he said, all of that worthless. Jesus is the thing that matters today. Knowing Jesus was the most important thing. And Paul says, I counted it loss for the excellency of Christ Jesus my Lord. You know what he means? He says Jesus is so wonderful, so beautiful, so excellent that everything else pales in comparison to him. You know what Paul found out the more he got to know about Jesus? The more he wanted to know about Jesus. There was never a point that he said, you know, Jesus is a pretty interesting guy, but I think I know everything I want to know about him. Paul lived his entire life saying, I want to know a little bit more about Jesus. Everything I learned about him, he becomes more adorable and lovable and beautiful and excellent to me. Everything else doesn't matter because I want to know about Jesus because he's that wonderful. Knowing Jesus and the power of his resurrection and the purity of his love and the beauty of his grace was greater than anything else, even really good things. It was better than that. And Paul goes so far in this verse to say that he counted the rest of it, what? Dung in comparison to the knowledge of Christ. You know what dung is, right? Are you familiar with what dung is? It's not something you collect. It's not a tchotchke that you put on your mantle. It's rubbish, it's trash, it's feces, it's gross. It might be good for throwing on the field at the farm, but that's about it. And Paul said, all that other stuff that I clamored for, all that other stuff that I worked so hard for, I don't care a thing about it now. It's the garbage pile now. Because Jesus is that wonderful and that great. He said, knowing Jesus is so wonderful that everything else is garbage by comparison. Can you remember a time in your life that you went through maybe like a major transition? Maybe for some of you it was graduating from high school, getting your first real job, starting a career, starting a family, getting married, having children. And after that major transition, the people that you used to hang around with all of the time, they were still your friends, but suddenly they couldn't understand you because there was stuff in your life that was so important to you now that they didn't have in their life. And they just couldn't understand why you were so fascinated with it, why it mattered so much to you. It's not that you became a different person, but you had new priorities. And suddenly the things that you used to before you had a kid, they didn't seem that great. I mean, think about yourself 10 years ago, those of you that are parents. What would you have done on New Year's Eve? And then last night, you hung out with your kids and you played Trouble, right? And you loved it because you love your kids. Your priorities are different. Paul is saying, I came to know Jesus and he became the priority in my life. The stuff that used to be so important to me, it pales in comparison to Jesus. And then Paul gives us a really good reason that we should want to know Jesus above all else. He tells us that nothing is more important than knowing Jesus because righteousness comes from knowing Jesus. The people that Paul was dealing with were trying to manufacture their own righteousness. If you do this, then you'll really be holy. If you do this, then you'll really be religious. If you do this, then you'll really be close to God. And Paul says, listen, the most important thing is knowing Christ because Christ gives you that righteousness. Christ gives you that thing that you're trying to manufacture. He gives you that thing that you're trying to raise up in your life. And Paul says, knowing Jesus makes us right, and not just by our own standards, but by God's standards. Look at verses 9 and 10. And be found in him, not having mine own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection. Do you know someone who has incredibly high expectations? Really high standards? Maybe you're around them at Christmas. And their expectations are really hard to meet. Their expectations, their standards are really hard for you to meet. Did you know that there is no one's standard that comes anywhere near God's standard? No one's expectations come any higher than God's expectations. And Paul says that through knowing Jesus, I am made right, and not just my own right, not just what I think is right, but God's right through faith in Jesus. I don't just reach my own standards. I don't just reach my mother-in-law's standards. I reach God's standards of what is right and acceptable through Jesus. The standard that Paul had been chasing his entire life by trying to become righteous through the law. He says, my own righteousness through the law. Paul was an incredibly dedicated Jew, obeying all of the commands, not just the 10 that we're familiar with, but all the laws that they added onto it. He obeyed them all, trying to earn his righteousness, trying to manufacture his righteousness. He worked his entire life trying to be right, trying to be justified. And he never attained it. He was closer than most, but he never attained it. And then he met Jesus, and Jesus handed it to him. Handed it to him. Now, some of you here, you've been working so hard. You've been working so hard to make your life acceptable. You've been living so tight, trying to meet other people's expectations, and you failed, and you failed, and you failed, and you found that you don't have it in your power to live this life. So you've kept trying, or you've lowered your standards. And Paul says, Jesus, knowing him, he hands it to you. He gives it to you. I'm not a gamer. I haven't played a video game in years. And the last time I played a video game was with some of the guys in the youth group, the teen group, and they just laughed and laughed and laughed at me. It was one of those games where you fight each other, you know, and they just all killed Pastor Daniel repeatedly, again and again and again, you know. And it's really not nice to shoot a guy who's just walking in circles like this, you know. Not much of a gamer. But when I was a kid, I had the original Nintendo. And one Christmas, I got Super Mario Brothers 3. And through Christmas break, I played so hard. And back then, you got to remember, back then, you didn't save your game. So if you had to turn it off and go somewhere, like it was over. If your sister tripped over the cord and turned it off, it was over. If you died, you had to start back at the very beginning. And I worked so hard, and I would get up to level 6 on this game, and I couldn't get past level 6. And I would die, and I'd have to start all the way back over and get up to level 6 of this game. And I went to back to school after Christmas break, and I was talking to one of my buddies, and he said, well, don't you know about the magic flute or whatever it was? And I was like, what are you talking to me? He said, it's a cheat code that if you use it, you get to level 9. And I was simultaneously half relieved there was a way that I could get past level 6 that I had not been able to beat, but also a little angry. That here all Christmas break, I've been trying so hard to get past this level, and there was this cheat code that you could just skip it altogether. Paul had been working his entire life to be right. Been working his whole life to be just. And he meets Jesus, and Jesus hands it to him. He says, here is righteousness by God's standard. And some of you have been trying so hard to make your marriage work. You've been trying to get your life to the next level. You've been trying to stay sober. You've been trying to stay pure. You've been trying so hard to make your life right by your own standards or someone else's standards or God's standards. And the whole time, Jesus has been calling out and saying, here, let me give it to you. Let me hand it to you. Because knowing Jesus gives us God's standard of righteousness. Paul says in verse 9, the righteousness which is through faith of Christ. The righteousness which is of God by faith. See, the way that you're made right by God's standard is not through a cheat code. It's through faith. It's through believing in Jesus. It's trusting Him. It's saying, Jesus, I believe that you can give me righteousness. And I believe that your ways are right. And I'm going to follow you. Nothing is more important than knowing Jesus. Nothing's more important than knowing Jesus because He gives us righteousness. And because nothing is more important than knowing Jesus, Paul spent his life chasing after the knowledge of Jesus. Verse 12 says, not as though I had already attained, either were already perfect, but I follow after that I may apprehend that for which also I'm apprehended of Christ. Paul says, I've made nothing more important in my life than knowing Jesus and the power of His resurrection, because it's He who makes me righteous, and it's He who gives me life after death. And he says, and I recognize that I'm not already there yet. And I recognize that I'm not perfect, that I haven't attained. So I follow after that I may apprehend that which apprehended me. I want you to grab hold of that statement with both hands and even your teeth. That I may apprehend that which apprehended me. The word that he uses there, it means to get. And it means both to catch, but also to understand. And so it's used in the Gospels when these people, they find a woman who's committing adultery. They catch her in the act of committing adultery. They bring her to Jesus and say, what are you going to do with this woman that we caught in adultery? But it's also used in the Gospels when John chapter 1 says that Jesus was the light that came into the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. The darkness didn't get it. The darkness didn't understand it. Paul is saying, I am chasing after, I'm trying to get that which got me. I'm trying to understand that which captured me. Do you get it? Do you follow it? Paul says, I'm not there yet. God's given me His righteousness, but I am striving, I am chasing to catch what caught me. He says, I've not arrived yet. On the contrary, I'm chasing hard after Jesus, making knowing Him the most important thing in my life so I can get what got me, so I can understand what caught me, so I can apprehend what apprehended me. In my life, I was running hard from everything that Jesus wanted to give me. I was running hard in the opposite direction of God's desires for my life. I was running hard from Him, but I'm so thankful that He caught me, that He reached down and He grabbed me and He got a hold of me. And I've been spending my life ever since trying to reach up to grab a hold of Him, to get a hold of the love that got a hold of me. I'm so thankful that He got a hold of me. I'm so thankful that He reached down to get a hold of me. And I'm doing my best to rise up and reach up and get a hold of the love that caught me. In 2017, I want you to join me as we rise up. I want you to join me as we rise up to who it is that God has called us to be. I want you to rise up with me as we answer the calling that God's placed on our lives to change our world, starting here in our own city. I want you to rise up with me as we answer God's call to bring Him glory, starting within our own hearts. I want us to rise to follow Jesus out of this loop that we've been stuck in year after year, resolution after resolution, commitment after commitment, and we're going in this loop. Let's rise out of the loop and follow Jesus out of this circle onto a new terrain where He will lead us and take us to mountaintops that we can't imagine, and He'll walk with us in every valley that's in between. I invite you to rise up with me to the challenge of becoming who it is that God created us to be. I invite you to rise up, to reach up for the love that reached down for us. Paul says, I'm in pursuit of the one who pursued me. I'm trying to catch the one who caught me. I want to know Him. I want to understand Him and the power of His resurrection. You don't have the power to rise up on your own. You don't have the power to be different on your own. You don't have the power to quit on your own. But if you know Him, you can know the power of His resurrection, and the same power that brought Jesus out of the grave, that conquered death, can be ours if we know Him. Friends, if we're going to rise up through the power of the resurrection. We're going to rise up through the knowledge of Jesus Christ. If we know Him, we can rise up. And if you know Him, and you know that He caught you, you know that He saved you, you know that He kept you from walking off the path into the utter abyss, let me invite you to join me as we rise up to apprehend that which apprehended us, to catch what caught a hold of us. Let's pursue the one who pursued us. To say we rise is to chase after the love that chased us down. That's what he did. Beginning of this year in January, our sermons are going to focus on rise. We're going to rise to the calling that God's placed in our lives. We need that to happen at our church. We need people to rise up to the calling that God's placed on them. We need people to rise up into places of service. We need people to rise up to live lives that are exemplary, that can serve as an example to those younger believers that come behind them. We need to rise. Our community desperately needs a church that will rise up to be a beacon of hope and light in this town. We need to rise. But it's not within us to rise. We do not have the strength to rise. We do not have the willpower to rise. We do not have the ability or the gifts needed to rise. It is only in Him. And so this morning, I don't point back at you and say, it's in your hands. I point up at Him and I say, it's in His hands.